The sun dipped low as Albert Hale stepped out of his pickup truck and took his first full breath of the Maple Creek air. The streets were quiet too quiet. Perfectly trimmed hedges lined identical houses painted in warm but muted tones. The kind of place where time seemed to slow down and whispers died in neatly mowed lawns. After 3 decades in law enforcement, Albert had seen enough chaos to last a lifetime. Maple Creek, with its serene layout and polished facades, promised peace and a new beginning. He had come here not for adventure, not to play hero, but to forget, or at least try. He passed by a couple watering their garden who offered a nod, but nothing more. A woman walking her dog crossed the street before reaching him, eyes darting away as if afraid of something unseen, something unspoken. He chalked it up to new neighbor awkwardness, but deep down something tugged at his instincts. That same invisible thread he had followed in countless investigations now stirred. Later that afternoon, as he unloaded boxes onto the porch, a figure approached. An elderly man stooped but sharp in the eyes. He didn't introduce himself, just stopped at the gate and said in a low voice, almost swallowed by the wind, "You seem like a man who notices things. So let me give you one piece of advice. Keep your head down and don't ask questions, not here. Not if you want peace." Albert stood there, one hand gripping the edge of a box, the other resting instinctively near his belt, though he no longer carried a badge. He tried to laugh it off, but the old man had already turned and disappeared behind a row of bushes, leaving only the echo of those strange words behind. As twilight settled and shadows stretched across the pristine driveways, Albert sat on his porch watching the silence. It felt too perfect. And perfection, he had learned, often hides the deepest rot. Something told him he hadn't stepped into a peaceful retirement. He had stepped into something else, something watching, something waiting. In the days that followed, Albert began to sense the weight of something invisible pressing against the walls of his new home. It was in the way neighbors smiled without warmth, their eyes slipping past him, as if afraid of meeting his gaze. It was in the quiet that felt too curated, too controlled. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was enforced. The community of Maple Creek operated like a finely tuned clock, but not one of harmony, rather one of control. At the center of it all stood the HOA, the Homeowners Association, an entity more powerful than Albert had imagined. He first heard the name Mara Whitman during a neighborhood meeting posted on his doorstep with a formal letter printed in serif font. Attendance was expected, punctuality required. The meeting was held in the grand clubhouse at the heart of the neighborhood, where no laughter echoed and no children played. Mara stood at the front, poised immaculately, her smile stretched and eyes cold, calculating. Next to her, her son Colby leaned against the podium, arms crossed, as though daring anyone to question their rule. Albert listened as Mara listed regulations, not suggestions, but laws written in stone. Grass height down to inches, mailbox color, approved shades, only curtain materials required to be white or beige. Even the seasonal decorations were regulated. One resident timidly asked about installing solar panels and was quickly shut down with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mara said it wouldn't preserve the uniform aesthetic. Colby chuckled low under his breath like a warning. It wasn't just the rules, it was how they were enforced. Albert noticed warning letters taped to doors without explanation. He heard of fines issued for things as small as leaving trash cans visible for too long. One morning, he found a yellow slip tucked under his door handle, informing him that his potted fern exceeded HOA plant height regulation. He had moved it to the porch just the day before. He hadn't told anyone. Neighbors grew quieter when he asked questions. Alice, the young schoolteacher who lived across the street, avoided eye contact after he mentioned the notice. The couple next door began pulling their blinds when he stepped outside. It wasn't fear of him, it was fear of something else, something bigger. Albert knew this feeling. He had seen it in towns controlled by gangs, by corrupt councils. The shape of fear was always the same, just the mask changed. In Maple Creek, the mask was manicured lawns and symmetrical hedges, but the fear ran deep, rooted like ivy and brick. The HOA was not just enforcing order, it was creating silence. A silence no one dared to break. As Albert stood at his window that night, watching the streetlights flicker, one thought burned brighter than the others. Peace had a price here, and someone was collecting the toll. It was the kind of morning that should have felt peaceful, the kind where the air is still and the birds take their time to sing. But something was wrong. Albert knew it the moment he stepped onto his porch and looked at the driveway. His truck was gone. Not just any truck, but the old navy blue pickup he had rebuilt with his late wife, piece by piece over long summers. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was memory. It was love preserved in metal and engine grease. And now it was gone without a trace. At first, he thought maybe it had been towed, but there were no tire marks, no notices, no sounds from the night before. He had parked it there like always under the soft light of the lamppost just beyond the trimmed hedge. The quiet felt sharper that morning, like the street was holding its breath. He knocked on a few doors, asked if anyone had seen anything. Most opened just a crack enough to deliver an apologetic shrug or a hesitant no, and then closed quickly, as if the question itself was dangerous. Albert walked to the security office near the community entrance, asking to see the camera footage. The man behind the desk shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking to the side before replying that the cameras had suffered a malfunction overnight. A power surge, maybe something with the software. He had heard excuses like this before during years of police work, and he knew what they sounded like when they were lies. Later that day, Mara paid him a visit. She arrived unannounced, calm, graceful, dressed as if for an elegant brunch. Her tone was pleasant, almost soothing, but every word coiled with menace. She tilted her head and said she was sorry to hear about the loss. Accidents happen sometimes, even in a safe neighborhood like this. Perhaps the truck had been parked improperly, or maybe someone mistook it for abandoned. These things can be unpredictable, she said with a thin smile that tightened at the corners. Then she placed a hand on his arm and added softly, "You've only just arrived." Mr. Hale, sometimes it's easier to settle in when we all follow the same rhythm. Albert stood frozen not from fear, but from the clarity of what he was hearing. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. The truck wasn't just taken, it was erased as if it had never belonged here, as if he had never belonged. And no one would speak up. No one would help. That night, he sat alone on the porch where his truck once stood, a shadow of grief rising like a tide in his chest. But beneath the sadness was something colder and sharper. Resolve. They thought silence would bury him. They had no idea who they were trying to silence. The next morning, Albert rose before dawn, his eyes heavy, but his mind sharper than it had been in years. The ache of losing the truck still pulsed beneath his ribs, but now it fueled him. Something had been taken from him, something personal and sacred, and that kind of theft was never random. It was a signal, a challenge. And he was going to respond the only way he knew how, by investigating it piece by piece until the truth could no longer hide. He began by walking the neighborhood slowly, deliberately, as if retracing invisible steps. He memorized patterns, which houses kept their blinds drawn, which driveways had tire tracks that changed overnight, which cars came and went without tags or decals. He noticed the same white SUV circling the block at odd hours, always pausing near the clubhouse but never parking. He took mental notes of street lamp positions, blind spots, angles where a camera could be hidden without being seen. He kept a notebook tucked in his back pocket, not to write, but to give him cover, so if someone looked out, they'd think he was just another old man sketching or journaling, not documenting the cracks in their perfect little world. He struck up quiet conversations at the mailbox and near the dog park, offering friendly nods that slowly turned into cautious exchanges. Most residents were tight-lipped, but there were moments, brief flickers in their eyes that told him they wanted to say more, but couldn't. Fear had a shape here, and it hung in the air like morning mist. Eventually, it was a man named Harry who gave him his first lead. Harry lived near the edge of the development, in a house that looked older than the rest, slightly unkempt, as if untouched by the HOA's iron standards. One afternoon, Harry motioned Albert over with a twitch of his fingers and spoke barely above a whisper. "You're poking at something dangerous. They don't like people who ask too many questions. They've done worse than steal trucks." "What do you mean?" Albert asked, keeping his voice even. Harry glanced around, then leaned in closer. "Colby has men. Not security guards, not officially. They dress plain, but they show up when someone files a complaint or refuses to pay a fine. Last year, a woman tried to get a petition going to challenge Mara. 2 weeks later, she was gone. House sold in a day. No goodbye, no forwarding address. Just gone. That night, Albert stood by his window in the dark, watching shadows move across the street. He wasn't just dealing with petty corruption. This was something deeper, a machine disguised as order, feeding on compliance and silence. But now the silence had been disturbed. He knew how to hunt, and even without a badge, he still had instincts sharper than any camera, and patience colder than fear. The investigation had begun, and Albert would not stop until he found the truth, no matter where it led or what it cost. The deeper Albert dug, the more the mask of Maple Creek began to crack. It was no longer a hunch, no longer whispers behind closed doors. What he uncovered was a quiet empire, built not on law, but on fear. Each piece came slowly like puzzle fragments, scattered through silence and shame. Bank records tucked into unlocked mailboxes, copies of invoices for repairs that were never done, receipts from contractors with no names, just P.O. boxes. There was a pattern, and the name Colby Whitman kept appearing, always at the center. Albert followed the paper trail with the precision of a man who had spent decades exposing criminals who thought they were invisible. He cross-referenced contractor licenses with city records and found shell companies listed under initials and ghost addresses. He realized the HOA had been awarding contracts to these fake firms, siphoning money from residents through inflated fees and fake violations. Those who questioned it were fined, harassed, or made to leave. It wasn't just about power. It was about profit, masked beneath the facade of order. One afternoon, he approached a local attorney, a friend of a friend, to quietly ask about legal recourse. At first, the man was interested, eager even to dig in. But the next day, he called Albert and told him he had to drop the matter. No explanation, just a hollow apology. Albert knew that voice. It was the voice of a man who had been warned and who had listened. He didn't blame him. Not everyone was built to fight shadows. Later that week, as he walked home from the market, he felt it. A car slowed behind him, tires whispering over the asphalt. He turned just in time to catch a glimpse of a face through the windshield, unfamiliar cold. The car didn't stop, but the message was clear. We see you. That night, as he lay in bed, bruised from being shoved into a hedge by two masked figures, he didn't feel defeated. He felt something else, a flame rekindled. They had tried to scare him off, but they had only confirmed he was getting close. They had made a mistake. They had treated Albert like just another quiet retiree. But Albert had hunted men who hid behind lies and silence, and he knew their patterns. He had stared down fear before and walked through it. Now he wasn't just seeking answers, he was seeking justice. And whoever was behind this would learn that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one who ends the storm. Albert had grown used to the silence of Maple Creek, to the way people lowered their eyes and locked their doors a beat too quickly. He had accepted that if he were to bring this corrupt machine down, he would have to do it alone. But something changed one evening, just as the sun began to bleed gold across the rooftops. A soft knock came at his door, timid, barely audible. When he opened it, he found Alice, the young schoolteacher from across the street, standing there with nervous hands and a determined look in her eyes. She stepped inside without a word, her voice barely rising above a whisper, as she told him that she had seen his truck being taken that night weeks ago. She had wanted to speak up, but fear had gripped her like chains. Now she could no longer look at herself in the mirror, knowing she had stayed quiet. Albert listened without interrupting, then simply nodded, offering no judgment, only a seat and a cup of warm tea. It was the first time in a long while someone had chosen truth over comfort in this place. And it sparked something rare hope. Within days, a few more joined them. Devin, a soft-spoken computer engineer who had once tried to contest an unjust fine and was mysteriously locked out of his HOA account. Maria, a widowed mother who had been pressured to repaint her home 3 times in a year and suspected she was being targeted for refusing Colby's advances. Together, they formed something fragile but powerful, a bond forged not in ideology, but in shared injustice. They began meeting in secret, rotating between garages and basements, lights dimmed, voices low, hearts racing. They called themselves Lightwatch, a name whispered in the dark like a promise. Devon built a hidden online hub where they could upload documents and evidence without being traced. Alice started collecting testimonies from other residents, disguised as friendly chats over coffee. Maria combed through years of HOA meeting notes line by line, uncovering inconsistencies and missing funds. Albert became the anchor, the one who reminded them why they had started and what was at stake. He moved with quiet confidence, never rushing, always watching, always listening. His years on the force had taught him the difference between chaos and strategy, and now he applied every ounce of that wisdom to dismantling the rot inside Maple Creek. Behind closed doors, a quiet rebellion began to grow. It moved like roots under pavement, unseen but unstoppable. For the first time in a long while, the silence was breaking, and with it came the first breath of freedom. The night of the community meeting arrived heavy with tension that settled into the air like a storm about to break. For the first time since Albert had moved into Maple Creek, the clubhouse was full. Rows of chairs lined with faces both familiar and distant, residents who had once walked with their heads down now sat upright, glancing at one another with cautious curiosity. Something was different. Something was shifting. Whispers moved across the room like a rising tide, but Albert stood still near the front, his jaw set, his eyes steady. At precisely 7, Mara Whitman entered, flanked by Colby, who stood just behind her, like a shadow that had grown teeth. She smiled the same rehearsed smile that had for years quieted dissent and crushed doubt with the softest touch. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice smooth, controlled. She spoke of unity, of the HOA's tireless efforts to maintain order, of how small disruptions threatened the beauty and security they all cherished. Albert let her speak. He let the illusion dance one last time. When she paused, he stepped forward, holding a flash drive in one hand and a small remote in the other. With a single click, the screen behind her flickered to life. The room fell silent. What followed were not accusations, but proof. A video taken by Devon's hidden camera showing Colby in a dimly lit garage accepting envelopes stuffed with cash from a contractor. Audio of Mara discussing how to strategically find residents who complained. Screenshots of altered maintenance records and emails sent under false names approving payments to ghost companies. Every image, every word hit like a crack of thunder, breaking through the veil of decorum. Mara's smile faltered. Colby stood straighter, his fists clenched, but said nothing. The room which had once belonged to them now belonged to the truth. Residents gasped, some with tears, some with quiet anger, as years of unanswered questions finally made sense. Albert turned to the crowd not to lecture, but to ask a question that rang louder than any evidence. Do we want to live in fear, or do we want to take back our home? Then it happened. A voice from the back said, enough, followed by another and another, until the room echoed not with silence but with defiance. Mara tried to regain control, raising her voice, invoking legal threats, but it was too late. The dam had broken. A former board member stood and admitted he had been coerced into signing on fraudulent expenses, afraid for his job and his family. More stories poured forth, people who had moved away in fear, residents who had been isolated and punished for speaking out. In that moment, Maple Creek changed. No longer a place of submission, it became a community ready to confront its own reflection. Albert felt no triumph, only relief. The truth was never about victory, it was about light, and light had finally pierced the shadows. The days that followed moved like a whirlwind through Maple Creek, tearing away the silence that had once cloaked every sidewalk and porch. The footage, the documents, the testimonies had all been sent to the right hands, and within a week, unmarked sedans began appearing at the edges of the neighborhood. Men and women in suits stepped out, not with the politeness of neighbors, but with the resolve of people who had seen this before in other towns behind other doors. They asked questions, but not gently. They knocked, but never waited for invitations. The federal investigation had begun. Albert watched it unfold from his porch, not with pride, but with the quiet stillness of a man who knew what justice looked like when it finally woke up. Agents combed through HOA offices, seizing laptops, hard drives, financial records, even personal cell phones. Mara and Colby were both subpoenaed, and soon the entire facade of their perfect little empire began to crumble. Contractors came forward under immunity agreements admitting to kickback schemes and falsified invoices. A trail of shell companies, all traced back to Colby's alias, revealed millions of dollars siphoned from homeowner dues into private accounts across state lines. The residents of Maple Creek, once divided by fear, began to speak freely in hushed but honest tones at coffee shops, in driveways, across fences. It was as if the weight pressing on their chests for years had lifted, and now all that remained was air and disbelief. Children played louder again. Music returned to windows that had long been shut, and neighbors greeted one another without glancing over their shoulders. Lightwatch was no longer a secret, but a symbol, and Albert no longer had to walk alone. One morning before sunrise, federal marshals arrived at the Whitman estate, their boots echoing on stone as they approached the grand door. Mara answered, still in her silk robe, still wearing the remnants of the power she thought would shield her. Behind her, Colby stood, rigid jaw, clenched arms raised without a word as the cuffs clicked into place. It was quiet, not a single cry or scream, just the steady hum of justice at work. News vans rolled in later that day, broadcasting what had happened here to the rest of the state. The headlines called it a community shaken by corruption, but inside Maple Creek, they knew better. They had not been shaken, they had been awakened. The gates that once kept the world out had also kept the truth in, and now those gates had opened wide. Albert walked the perimeter that evening, stopping at the corner where his truck had once stood. It had been found weeks before in a rented garage, registered under a false name, stripped but not destroyed. A mechanic friend had helped him tow it back, and it now sat in his driveway covered in dust but whole. Just like this community. The darkness that had ruled Maple Creek had finally met something it could not contain: truth. And truth had worn the face of quiet people who dared to speak, and one man who refused to forget what justice felt like. The first true morning of freedom in Maple Creek came not with a grand celebration, but with something far more powerful, a simple silence that felt clean. The air was lighter, the streets quieter, in a peaceful way, not forced, but earned. For the first time in years, birdsong was louder than tension, and children's laughter drifted without being hushed. It was as if the whole neighborhood had been holding its breath and now finally exhaled. A new HOA board was elected, not in secret or through quiet manipulation, but in the open, under the sun, in front of a crowd of residents who had finally found their voices. Alice was chosen as the new president, not because she wanted power, but because people trusted her. She stood on the clubhouse steps when the results were announced and spoke softly with trembling hands but a steady gaze. "This place belongs to all of us," she said, "and from now on, no one will live in fear." Devon was asked to build a new communication system, one that would keep everything transparent and accessible. Maria led a committee to support families who had been wrongfully fined or evicted, helping them reconnect and even return if they wished. The old clubhouse walls, once lined with portraits of past presidents, now displayed framed stories of courage, of voices that rose when it was hardest. There was no need for polished smiles anymore. People met each other with real eyes and honest words. Albert kept to the background as he always had, not out of humility, but because he knew the work was never about him. He sat on his porch each morning, watching the street as neighbors waved and children zipped by on bicycles. His truck, parked once more in its rightful place, stood as quiet proof that what was lost could be recovered, not just in metal, but in meaning. One evening, Alice brought him a small wooden plaque engraved with the words, "To the man who reminded us that silence is not peace." He smiled but said little, only placing it beside the fern on his porch, the same fern that once brought him a warning, now standing tall without fear. Maple Creek was not perfect, but it was healing. In every handshake, every open window, every shared laugh, there was something reborn. It was no longer a neighborhood of rules, but a community of people, the kind who had faced the darkness and stepped into the light together. And Albert knew with certainty that justice was not just a word, it was a seed. And here at last it had begun to grow. The sun rose slowly over Maple Creek, casting golden light across the rooftops and warming the sidewalks that had once felt cold with fear. The wind moved gently through the trees, rustling the leaves like whispers of stories finally told. On the front lawn near the entrance of the neighborhood stood a new sign carved in wood and metal, polished not with vanity but with pride. It read, "Maple Creek, a place where courage took root. Below it, in smaller letters, it said, "Community begins with truth." Albert Hale stood nearby, watching as a few residents passed by, pausing to read the words. Some smiled, some grew quiet, and some placed a hand on the sign as if to say, "I remember." Albert did not need applause or recognition. His satisfaction was in the rhythm of footsteps that no longer hesitated, in the sound of laughter that no longer died in silence. The world he had stepped into with suspicion and burden was now a place of morning light and open doors. He had come to Maple Creek for peace and found something greater purpose. Not the kind worn like a badge or shouted across headlines, but the kind that settled deep and quiet like roots beneath the soil. His actions had started a ripple, but it was the people who turned it into a wave. Alice Maria Devon and so many others who chose to speak when it would have been easier to stay silent. That was the real victory. The legacy not of a man, but of a moment when truth rose and was met with open hearts. He spent his days in simple ways, tending to the garden, fixing the dents in his old truck, taking slow walks past homes now filled with warmth. Children waved to him, teenagers nodded with respect, and adults often stopped just to say thank you, with no need to explain what for. In a world that often forgets quiet heroes, Albert had become a living reminder that one voice can echo loud enough to change everything. As evening fell and the sky turned shades of amber and violet, Albert sat on his porch, the same place he had stood the day he arrived. The wind carried the scent of cut grass and summer blossoms, and in that moment he felt whole. He looked out over the street and whispered not to anyone, just to himself. Sometimes justice is not about punishment, it is about reminding people what right feels like. And so the story of Maple Creek did not end with sirens or trials, but with light, with a neighborhood that remembered how to live with each other again. The man who had once come in search of silence left behind something far more powerful, the sound of a community finally at peace with the truth.